Okay, so here's an insider tip, friends. As someone who lives in New England, I want you to know that the falls here are awesome. We have amazing fall foliage, like apple cider, donuts, pumpkins, and just this really great, cool, crisp weather. But every year in October, there are these two issues, these two national fights that come up, and they've been going on for years and years. The first actually just happened recently. It is the ongoing debate over the second Monday in October. Now, officially, it's called Columbus Day, but in many places across the country, it has now been renamed Indigenous Peoples Day, and there is growing bitterness over whether Columbus Day should stay Columbus Day or become Indigenous Peoples Day. The second perennial fight is one that is coming up soon, and it is the debate over daylight savings time. Every year at the end of October, in fact, the first Sunday in November, we turn our clocks back and go back to what is called standard time. But in the past few years, there's been an increasing argument that we should stay on daylight savings time for the entire year. And in fact, this past year in May, the Senate approved a bill that would eliminate regular time and would keep us permanently on daylight savings time. Now, the House has not picked that up yet. And in fact, it is another annual fight that we seem to have every October. So my experience suggests that while many Americans don't spend a huge amount of their energy debating these, there are a growing number of people who feel very strongly about these issues, and there is a sense that change is in the air in both of these instances. So today I'm going to identify two factors inherent in each of these conflicts and that are common in many disputes that make them especially tough to resolve. And then I'm going to offer two key strategies to turn those barriers into successful win-win outcomes for all. I'm Bob Bordone. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School. I am the founder and former director of Harvard Law School's Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, and I'm the founder and principal of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. Let's go. Okay, so let's start with the first of these two features that make the Columbus Indigenous Peoples Day debate and also the daylight savings time debate extremely challenging. And that is that there is a sense that in both of these situations, the conflict is zero-sum. In other words, at the end of the day, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. And as any of you who watch my videos know, I teach all about mutual gains or interest-based negotiation. The idea that we can actually create value or expand the size of the pie in negotiation. And yet, with respect to Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, it feels like at the end of the day, on the second Monday in October, it will either be Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, but not both. Similarly, with respect to daylight savings time, at the end of the day, we will either every year turn our clocks back in the fall and spring our clocks forward in the spring, or alternately, we will stay permanently on daylight savings time. There's no splitting the difference. There's no middle ground here. And so in this sense, right, it's really different from the classic example that we talk about in mutual gains negotiation, right? That's the story of the two sisters who are fighting over the last orange in the house, and splitting it in half at least silences them, but it's not as good as actually asking them why they want the orange and learning that one wanted the fruit to eat and the other wanted the peel for the zest in a cake she's baking. Here, it's like Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, daylight savings time, or not. But there's a second reason why these conflicts, I think, feel particularly fraught. And that's because they actually relate to questions of narrative, of identity, of history, and tradition. So consider the Columbus Day versus the Indigenous Peoples Day debate. People who argue on behalf of Indigenous Peoples Day make the very real point that Christopher Columbus, maybe he was an explorer, but he was also a brutal conqueror. He attempted the genocide of an entire people. And so having a national holiday that glorifies him is actually offensive, hurtful, We are celebrating someone who was dehumanizing and cruel and brutal. And so having a date that celebrates him as a national holiday conjures up a violent history of 500 years of colonial oppression at the hands of European explorers and those who settled here. And it's a history whose ramifications and whose wounds still run very, very deep today. But then consider the argument on behalf of those who would want to preserve Columbus Day. Columbus Day was actually established as a day to celebrate Italian Americans and their heritage. And in fact, it was adopted at a time when Italians in the United States were vilified. They faced religious and ethnic discrimination. In fact, the first commemoration of Columbus Day came in 1892, a year after the mass lynching of 11 Italian Americans by a mob in New Orleans. And so when Columbus Day became a national holiday in 1934, it was really a way to mainstream and humanize Italian Americans into the story of the United States. So for many Italian Americans, Columbus Day is not about celebrating Christopher Columbus, but rather about celebrating Italian people and their search for acceptance and safety in a new country. Now, let me be clear. You cannot compare the power of the hurt and emotion and history around Columbus Day with the debate around daylight savings time. So make no mistake, I'm not trying to do that. Having said that, right, there are elements of history and tradition and story in that debate as well. So for those living in rural areas where agriculture is a big and still very important industry, they can feel strongly that it's incredibly important to turn the clocks back in the fall, because otherwise even more of their work is done in the dark, in the mornings before the sun comes up. Similarly, parents of young children who need to walk to school or wait at a bus stop also feel strongly that we need to turn the clocks back so that their kids are not walking unsafely in the dark. Quite apart from these stories that are really important, being a good parent or being able to do your job and having the role of agriculture valued in our country, it turns out there's a lot of research about health and sleep and productivity benefits of turning the clock back in the fall. But at the same time, advocates of daylight savings time for the whole year point to palpable positive effects on the economy because of daylight savings time. For example, there's been shown to be a 3.5% increase in retail spending during months of daylight savings time that is linked to the time difference. In addition, we know that daylight savings time tends to promote a more active lifestyle, at least according to some researchers. So the upshot here, right, is that this debate around daylight savings time is also fraught with a fair amount of emotion and some real sense that something might be lost by some communities if we make a change to the status quo. Okay, so nothing like me to put a downer on the fall, but you know what? There is some advice on how you can unlock impasses where it seems like it's zero-sum, or where it seems like there's a deeply embedded narrative or story that's in play. So let me start with my first piece of advice. With respect to the zero-sum nature of a conflict, it's always helpful to look to expand the issues and then look to meet underlying interests. In fact, many zero-sum conflicts are not really zero-sum. On the one hand, it may seem that the second Monday in October either has to be Indigenous Peoples Day or Columbus Day. But on the other hand, I'm not so sure. And here's why. If we really seek to understand the interests of both sides, there's actually a lot more similarity than difference here. For those who favor changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, their interests include honoring the life, contribution, dignity, and value of their ancestors in the face of discrimination and hate and violence. They also want to avoid honoring someone who perpetrated deep injuries on their people and who dishonored and disrespected their humanity. But you know, for those who want to preserve Columbus Day as Columbus Day, it's really not about Christopher Columbus the explorer. In fact, it's about honoring the life, contribution, and dignity of their ancestors in the face of discrimination, hate, and violence. And also honoring a sense of exploration. You know, once we get to those interests, there are any number of value-creating possibilities that might work. I want to share one with you that is real and kind of cool. Because in the state of Colorado, the way they handle this is they have a new state holiday. The state holiday is called Mother Cabrini Day. Who was Mother Cabrini? Well, she was an Italian nun, so honoring Italian people, who created 67 schools, hospitals, and orphanages in the United States to care for immigrants. In fact, Mother Cabrini is the patron saint of immigrants. So by creating a Mother Cabrini Day, this is not a compromise, but it is a way of honoring Italian Americans. It is a way of honoring someone who lifted up the dignity of people who were discriminated against, oppressed, and dehumanized in our country. And so it's creative and wonderful to think about. Now, what might this look like with respect to daylight savings time? Well, imagine this, right? Imagine a negotiation where the parties identified their concerns around health issues, business issues, agriculture, safety, and then agreed to a time-limited experiment where each of these issues would be measured. So the way this might work would be, we're going to spend the next 3 years where we do not turn the clock back. We simply keep daylight savings time. And we're going to measure these statistics. And then we'll spend the next 3 years turning back daylight savings time, as we have been doing, and measure the results. And that can then help us make an informed decision about what might be the most enlightened and best way forward. Okay, my second piece of advice, and this really goes to the challenge of when people have embedded histories and narratives and story and emotions, and it's to really reframe the narrative and invite parties to create a new and shared narrative that picks up on their own story. So instead of framing Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day as a story about competing narratives, either the forces of Columbus Day win or the forces of Indigenous Peoples Day win, there is a new and joint story to be told here. Let me give you an example from my own experience. So when I was a student at Dartmouth College many years ago, there was a very divisive tradition. Officially, the school had stopped this tradition, and it was at class day, students would be given wooden pipes, and at the end of the ceremony of class day, they would take these wooden pipes and they would break them over an old pine. Now, you might be thinking, what is offensive about that? What is divisive about that? Well, here is the story. Dartmouth College was originally founded to educate Native Americans. And this pipe smoking ceremony was an important ceremony of theirs. The original idea of this tradition was that upon graduation, you would take this pipe and break it over this pine tree to show that you had broken with a barbaric tradition and had become Christianized. So as you can imagine, continuing this tradition was extremely offensive to Native peoples and their cultures and their tradition. For many years, the college had tried to ban this, but nonetheless, some students still did the ceremony. And then when I was a senior, my class committee actually did some really interesting research. Because if you actually look at the tradition at Dartmouth College, before the pipe ceremony, there was an even older ceremony where the graduating students would get in a circle around a wreath. At the end of the class day, they would sing a song, pick a piece of the wreath, and they would lay it on a pine tree. If there's one thing you need to know about Dartmouth College for this story to make sense, is that tradition means a lot. And the best way to get rid of an old tradition is to go back to an even older tradition. By understanding interests of the parties, we were able to initiate this tradition of the wreath that at once stopped the divisiveness around the pipes, but also honored other people's strong desire to do something that had a deep connection to history. Okay, so now that you have some strategies on how to think differently about two annual fall conflicts, Daylight Savings Time and Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, I want to invite you to get a donut, get some apple cider, and keep watching this next video, which is on how to talk about hot button topics such as abortion, gun rights, and queer rights. You know, with the election coming up very soon, I think you could probably use these skills right now. And of course, I'd be very grateful if you could like this video, ring the bell, and please subscribe to my channel. It means a lot. I'm Bob Bordone, and thanks for watching. Okay, you know you want some cider, donuts, and Bob Bordone video watching.